Pastor Scott here, and we are looking today at God's power and holiness as we continue to look at A Body of Divinity by Thomas Watson, this classic theological text. So first off, God's power. In the book of Job, chapter 9, it says this: if I speak of strength, lo, he is strong. So we start off here with God's power, and Watson says that God has authority. So he starts with authority. Nobody can argue with God, with his right to make decisions with him, because he has the final say. He is God. He's ultimate in his authority. And so on page 77, here's a good quote from Watson. It says, "He has salvation and damnation in his power. He has the key of justice in his hand, to lock up whom he will in the fiery prison of hell, and he has the key of mercy in his hand, to open heaven's gates to whom he pleases." Again there, Watson's openness to speak of hell and heaven, and to contrast these things and to talk about these things as if they matter. And of course, in the Christian biblical worldview, they do matter. And so Watson is being consistent there. But he's making this specific point that, Revelation 1, Jesus has, through his death and his resurrection, has victoriously attained the keys to death and Hades. He has authority over heaven and hell. In this way. But of course, authority is nothing if you have no power. So Watson then transitions over to not just infinite authority, but to talk about specifically, properly, infinite power. He says that God's infinite power is made manifest in his creative work as well as his redemptive work. So first he says about creation, he says to create requires infinite power because he needs no instruments to work with. He creates matter and then works upon it. So he has such power that he's able to create from nothing. But then he says, even with that great power of creation, he says greater power is put forth in conversion than in creation. And then he says why? He says because there's opposition in redemption, in converting souls. There's opposition, whereas in creation there really wasn't opposition. He goes on, he says Satan opposes God in conversion. Even the heart of the one of the sinner, the heart opposes him. A sinner is angry with converting grace. And perhaps, we who are Christians, who have gone through the process of conversion and we've been transformed, we know that our sinful hearts resist God's grace. But of course, God's grace is, at the end of the day, irresistible. There is a little qualification here that Watson puts out there, and it's important. And we should see this today because sometimes, atheists and others will come out and they'll say, well, God cannot really be considered all-powerful because, look, you even admit God can't do all things because he can't lie. He can't contradict himself, deny himself. But somebody like Watson would come back and say, well, okay, but this is, of course, not an external limitation, right? There's not some law out there that says God can't lie, but rather it's the issue of God's ultimate power is such that he does not contradict himself. So the limitation is not external, but it's internal. which you'd think would be the only kind of limitations that could exist for somebody who's all powerful. Even their limitations are only from themselves. All right, so I don't really see a contradiction there to say God's all powerful, but to say that he can't do certain things so long as those limitations are not from without, but are from within. 5 uses of the doctrine of God's power. Fear God. That's a big one. Fear God. Jeremiah says, will you not tremble at his presence? He's powerful. So fear him, revere him, respect him, honor him. Number 2, see the situation that sinful men are in, where this power is not for them, but against them. What an awful situation to be in if you don't know the Lord intimately in a peaceful relationship. Because this powerful God, his power is not for you in that case, because you make yourself to be an enemy against him, and so his ultimate power is therefore against you. Number 3, this doctrine reproves those who do not believe in the power of God. We doubt whether or not God can really help us. But Jeremiah says, is anything too hard for God? So this is a correction to us, a little bit of a reproof. Okay, hey, don't doubt the power of God, his ability to carry out his good promises for his people. Number 4, a warning to not harden your hearts against this mighty God. Don't be like Pharaoh. Don't be like those that we see in the scriptures who would harden themselves against God. Don't harden yourself against God. God can crack any nut, right? Number 5, get an interest in God. We've seen this one before. We see it again in this doctrine. Get an interest in this all-powerful God. Get an interest in this all-wise God. Get an interest in all of these other things. But here we're focusing on power. Get an interest in this all-powerful God, so that this mighty power is for you and not, as is true with the wicked, against you. Because, hey, your God can conquer your corruption. Your God can overcome the temptations of the strong man, Satan. God can strengthen you in times of weakness. God can provide in your deficiencies. God can resurrect the dead. We need to believe, says Watson, in that statement in the Creed that he is almighty, if we're going to believe in that subsequent doctrine, the resurrection of the body. And number 6, the ship of the church may be tossed because sin is in it, without any doubt, but it shall not be overwhelmed. Well, now let's transition to the holiness of God. What does Watson say about that? Well, God is holy intrinsically, primarily, efficiently, and transcendently. We see here again, Watson's a Puritan. He is a result of this Protestant scholasticism, and I think that's a good thing. It actually is helpful in teaching systematic theology to be able to break it down into these component parts. God is holy intrinsically. His nature is holy, and because his nature is holy, as the Psalms say in Psalm 145:17, the Lord is holy in all of his works. He's holy in his nature, so he's holy in all that he does, all that he produces. God is holy primarily. And what he means here is that he is the prime holy one. He is the original holy one. He's the original and the pattern of holiness, as Watson says. He's holy efficiently. He's the cause of all that is holiness in others. So James says, every good and perfect gift comes from above. James 1:17. God is holy transcendently. His holiness is far above the holiness of you and me, whether you're a Christian or whether maybe you're not a human, but you're an angel. We think of these as being holy. Well, God's holiness is transcendent, is so above, is of a whole nother kind, as we've talked about before, even than our holiness. Now, some would respond and they'd have this objection. They'd say, well, but God sees all of this sin. How is he not defiled? How is he not stained by this? Well, Watson responds. He says, God is, quote, no more defiled with them than the sun is defiled with the vapors that rise from the earth. It's a good little illustration there. So God sees sin, but he's not stained by it. And then, as Watson says, he's not a patron to approve of sin, but he's a judge to punish sin. And then we have three uses of the holiness of God. The first one, see how dissimilar sin is to God. Totally different, total opposites, right? What is sin? Sin is anything that contradicts God, that falls short of his commands or that transgresses his commands. God has no evil in him. There's no mixture of evil in God. Number two, how impious are they that are haters of holiness? And number three, this doctrine of God's holiness teaches us to imitate God's holiness. So be holy, for I am holy, Peter says. And this is, of course, not, Watson says, it's very helpful. It's not a holiness that is equal, the same, or univocal with God. It's not the same as God's holiness, but rather it's a holiness of similarity. Right? It's analogous to God's holiness. It mirrors, it resembles, but it's not the same thing. We'll actually come back to that here in just a second. So Watson then, he says, well, he asks the question, he asks, in what way can we be holy? Well, he says two things, really interesting. The first one, first he says, in our suitableness to God's nature. So you can be holy because you are actually designed in such a way to share in the holiness of God. Again, not in complete equality, not in the sense of the exact holiness of God, but analogous, similar. And he's really continuing to explain this. He says, the fact that you are made in the image of God, that's what he's talking about when he says we are suitable to God's nature. And that's why we can have his holiness. So Peter, in 2 Peter 1, he says that we are believers, we are made partakers of the divine nature. But that doesn't mean that we become the nature of God in that equality, in that univocal sense. We don't, take part of God in that way or become holy exactly in the way that God is holy. But rather, because we're image bearers, we image God and his divine nature as we image or reflect his meekness, his purity, his mercifulness in this analogous way that we've said. Second way that we can be holy as God is holy is by being in subjection to his will, which is, Watson says, the rule of holiness. I like the way that he puts that, the rule of holiness. And then what shall we do to resemble God in holiness? And a few just practical points. And he's already kind of told us what can we do? Well, we're designed to be holy, and then we follow his will. We follow his law. We reflect him in his character, which is told to us in the scriptures. But he gives us even a few more practical points. The first one is he says, be washed pure by the blood of Christ, by faith. So you can't be holy outside of being united to Jesus Christ by faith, trusting in him for your salvation, coming into a peaceful relationship with God through what Jesus Christ has done on the cross and in his resurrection, his perfect life, his work now at the right hand of God, right? The work of Christ. Second, he says, okay, if you're in Christ, right, pray that you would be more holy, that you would have a holy heart. And then third, and again, it's so practical, he says, walk with the holy. Proverbs says, he that walks with the wise will be wise. Proverbs 13:20. Watson says, association begets assimilation. Nothing has a greater power and energy to affect holiness than the communion of saints. So be with the church, specifically be with people who are mature, who are holy. It's that Titus 2, the more mature, teaching, modeling righteousness to the less mature within the church. So there you go. The power of God, the holiness of God. We will continue to walk through the doctrine of God with Watson in A Body of Divinity when we pick this up next time. See you then.